Katie, and this is the fourth episode of Ornamentations with a little bit of fall decor brought to you by my Huggies, which I made when I was 8. They were a very early object on my stitching journey. Some of the first things I ever did stitched on a machine, and I thought they were particularly appropriate for today because the subject of this episode is mistakes, and these have a few. The raw edges aren't turned under, the sides don't quite line up, and the back is, the arms and legs are stitched directly onto the back rather than inserted into the seams. Despite that, these are objects that have been loved and cherished by my mom ever since, and they get displayed every year as part of her fall decorating. She puts them in my dad's model cars, and the Huggies are racing around the house because, to quote her, Huggies have standards. So that's an early, not quite perfect object, but still one that's loved and cherished. And then today we will be talking about a much larger, later object that ended up being a success story, but at one point looked destined for certain failure because essentially I had, through my own inexperience, stitched myself into a corner that I really did not think I could get myself out of. Rescuing this piece required fundamentally reimagining what I thought it would be. And how I did that is the story of today's episode. So this piece was stitched and finished in 2017. I gave it to my mom for Christmas that year, but it actually started much earlier in 2014 when I was a new Cabinet of Curiosities student and really discovering the world of 17th century historic embroidery, starting to learn about some of the wonderful pieces that were out there, discovering museum collections, and in particular discovering one very specific panel in the collection of the Met. I'll insert a link in the description below. Please do not screenshot these photos. They belong to the Met. You can download a high resolution image from their website. I can't speak today, I'm sorry. But this is a very large stumpwork panel. It is about 22 by 18 inches, and it is entitled Two Ladies Personifying Taste and Touch. And as you can see, there is a great deal going on here. At first glance, it is overwhelming, and it's a piece that really rewards further study and a closer look, because it's when you start to zoom in that you see the things that make this exceptional. In particular, the one I'm going to focus on is that rose close to the center of the panel, and this is just extraordinary for a lot of reasons, but I'll focus on two, which are the extraordinary subtlety of the colors used here. The shading is very subtle, it's very nuanced, it flows smoothly from one shade to the next. Normally you see more gaps in shading in the 17th century. The colors are bolder and brighter. This much more muted and subtle shading is extremely unusual for the period. The other really interesting feature is the natural design of the rose. It's worked in thread, but it looks as if it could be a representation of a real rose. Motifs were generally more stylized in this era, much like the flowers I showed you on my Gloriana box in episode 2, which are much more typical of this period of embroidery. So this piece is quite an outlier, and that rose captivated me as soon as I saw it. I knew from the beginning that I really wanted to do something with it. So in 2014, after I did Amy Mitten's winter casket keepsakes and had done a little bit of detached buttonhole stitch, some basic needle lace, I did these early leaves styled after the Met ones. and this is stitched buttonhole stitch. It is worked in Soie 103 in 3 different shades. I was going for subtle in my shading, but using 3 single color shades that are very close to each other meant that they more just kind of blend into a single lump of green rather than the subtle shading effect I was going for. I was still learning, and I had a lot to learn about the subtleties of use of color in embroidery. But this did allow me to resolve an early technical problem which I was confronting, which was how to fill in these toothed edges on the leaves. You cannot go outside in on these. You have to work a center line and then go out one direction and then out in the other, which allows for a neat and detailed fill on those edges. So this was my first step towards the panel that eventually contained the Met Rose, or my interpretation of the Met Rose. And I think these are illustrative of the journey that you take on a panel of this scope, because it's not a straight line. There are a lot of false starts and stops. There are discards. I have an entire box of discarded pieces from past projects, which I'll show you at some point. So this is not unusual. It's not really a failure in that the pieces are perfectly well executed. They just weren't really doing what I needed them to do. And so I did some early sketching on this panel. I couldn't quite get what I was happy with. I didn't yet have the design experience to design something of this scale. And so I put it away for some years, and then I returned to it in 2017 when I was feeling a little more confidence. And I was also feeling like I really needed to make a start of some kind on my casket, because I had been a Cabinet of Curiosities student for several years at this point, and I hadn't put in a single stitch. I hadn't started a panel. I didn't have a single piece of fabric laced up. I hadn't even sketched a final design. I had nothing. And I thought it was about time that that changed. And in thinking about where to start, because the project still felt overwhelming to me, as I've discussed in previous episodes, I decided to go inside out, because I thought the interior was the lowest stakes place to start, because the exterior of an embroidered casket is always on display, but the interior is hidden. You don't have to look at it if you don't want to. If it's not everything that you dreamed, you shut the lid. And so that was where I decided to start. And to illustrate where I started, I have an unfinished casket here, as it has come from Trisha, of a slightly different design than the one I have completed. This is a flat top without doors, and this is how it comes. It's plain wood, and you have to do all the papering, all the finishing, and the installation of the hardware, which is provided yourself. And this is the interior of the lid. So just a plain open space. What makes this great is that it's very similar in scale and scope. So you are designing, stitching, and finishing a panel that's of a similar scale to your exterior spaces. And that makes it a very helpful exercise in working towards the big stuff. So that was what I decided to do. And this is the panel that I designed to that end, which shows a central stumpwork rose, like the Met one, on a ground which you can't see because my pencil lines are very faint, sorry. And then it's flanked by goldwork elements inspired by different periods, because I was learning a little bit more about myself as a stitcher at this point in my design sensibilities. And what I had learned was that although I was incredibly inspired by the 17th century pieces, I didn't want to strictly stitch reproductions. God, try saying that 3 times fast. And that I wanted to go beyond that. I wanted to bring other influences in, and I wanted to make a piece that felt uniquely my own. So to that end, I didn't just look at the Met panel we looked at. I looked at 17th century embroidered waistcoats, and I looked at modern haute couture embroidery. So I decided to have my stumpwork rose very closely mirror the Mets, but then have it flanked by all of these elements that I was bringing in different materials inspired by different periods. And so this is the finished piece. I can't show you any process photos. I had a data loss around this time. So you'll have to kind of imagine where I was. And this is the panel as it was finished with that wonderful stumpwork rose, which has 25 separate petals, which are worked individually and then attached to the ground fabric. They are wire edged, which gives them their shape. It also means that for every petal you have 2 wires poking out the end, which need to go through your ground fabric and onto the back. So with the leaves, I've got over 60 wires here just for the rose and leaves on the back of this piece. And it's got gilt running inside the buttonhole stitch, and the rose is worked in pink silks, which are mostly Amy Mitten's hand-dyed silks, which come in a really nice gradation of pink, and filled out with a couple colors from Soie. This is Soie 103 and Soie Gobelins. So together they make a really nice subtle shading group that I felt most closely approximated the Met piece. I did have some struggles trying to capture the color. This is actually the 3rd iteration of the rose I worked in. I tried a few other colorways, they were not working out. So this is how I ended up. And then all my leaves and the ground, again styled after the Met. This is thread that has been over twisted and then couched down in clumps, accented with freshwater pearls, with crystal beads, and with some faceted semi-precious gemstones. I don't even know what they are. I bought them at a bead store. They were not labeled. And then the central stumpwork rose is flanked by goldwork elements and pomegranates. And as you can see, I really loved the sparkle here, and these leaves are the ones that were inspired by haute couture embroidery. And I had a very general idea of what I wanted them to look like, but they were mostly a blank space on my design, and I quite literally filled them in as I went. I filled them out with a whole lot of spangles, which are not sequins. They are little bits of metal, so they're much heavier than sequins. And then used beads to anchor them in many cases, and then hex beads for that little extra bit of cut sparkly. More beads and spangles on this side, and then small garnets anchoring the spangles in the pomegranates. So I got about 75% of the way through this panel. I was, what? Oh, there's stuff in here. I gave this to my mom for Christmas in 2017. It originally contained a necklace, which obviously is in her real jewelry box, but apparently she put something else in here and it was falling out. Let's see what's inside. Mom. Okay, these are some beaded flowers that I made for her for Mother's Day a couple years ago, in which she apparently decided to put in her box so that they could fall out during my Flosstube, which, yeah, that was helpful. Okay, so going back to the box, hopefully nothing else is going to fall out of this. I was about 75% of the way through. I had done a lot of the goldwork elements. I had loaded on the spangles. I had loaded on the beads. I had put beads all over that central mound. I had put the garnets on the pomegranates. I had put spangles everywhere. I had just a little filler left. I had the peach in the corner here. The snail is really fun. And that bottom corner wasn't done yet. That silk stitching, accenting wasn't done. And the butterfly at the top wasn't done, but the bulk of this panel was together when I realized just how much weight was being added by all those beads and those spangles, which probably doesn't seem like a lot, but in the context of the function this piece was supposed to serve, it was extremely problematic because of gravity. So if you think about the interior of a lid, you glue it in here, and then it spends most of its life hanging upside down because the lid is closed and the piece is on the inside, so it's hanging flat. And gravity is a force that is working on it continually, which if it's your regular fabric embroidery, that's not really a problem. The glue evenly distributes the force and it'll be fine. There are embroidered pieces in the lids of many historic caskets and they're just fine. It's not like putting something inside the lid is fundamentally incompatible. What is fundamentally incompatible is putting something heavy inside the lid. And this, as I was working it, ended up being very, very heavy in the context of what gravity was going to do to it, because you have weight just in certain spots. It's not evenly distributed. You have weight where there are beads, and that weight, gravity is going to pull at it. It's going to pull downwards. It's going to weaken the bonds of the glue, and eventually it would cause the fabric to sag in those places. And once the fabric sags, there's no unringing that bell. And I knew I did not want that to happen to this piece, because this was something that as I was stitching, I loved it. It doesn't always happen that the vision in your head matches what you actually stitch. But in this case, what I had imagined and dreamed of was really coming to life under my hands, and I was so happy about that. I was just so thrilled to see this vision I had been thinking of and dreaming of for years actually being realized, which, you know, this was one of my first large pieces, and to have my stitching come out as I wanted it to was a big thing for me. But what I didn't realize was that with each bead and spangle I stitched on, I was inadvertently sabotaging that work. That while I was being carried along by the sparkles and the beauty and all of the things that I loved here, that I was making this completely incompatible with the design, the function that I wanted it to have, the interior of a lid. And I was faced with a crisis, which was that this piece could not be what I had designed it to be, and even worse, I could not fundamentally change what it would be because I had done something very, very stupid indeed. I have no idea what I was thinking. I had drawn in the exterior lines with micron pen. Is that showing? I don't think that's showing. There. There is a thin black line running all the way around the exterior of this piece. So that meant the design was essentially locked in. I couldn't expand it to be larger. I couldn't fundamentally change its form. It was a panel that had to stay as it was, but it couldn't be the interior of a casket lid. And it couldn't be the exterior either, because The interior of the lid is smaller than the exterior because of the sides. Also, it just wasn't what I planned for the exterior of my casket. So I was looking at this panel, which was probably 80% complete, which I loved and which I had absolutely no idea what to do with, how to finish it, what it could be. I knew that it couldn't be what I had designed it to be, and that if I were going to finish it, it had to become something completely different, something where the problems I had identified could be things that I could work around. So in addition to the weight issue, which I've already explained, and the problem of gravity, there was another thing to contend with here, and that was the finishing problems. So in 2017, I had done a little gluing. I had done some unsuccessful gluing. I had had a piece that I liked ruined by a bad gluing job. So I knew how badly this can go, and I realized that I had not developed and refined my finishing skills to the point where I could cope with a glue job this complicated because of all that bulk on the back, all those wires I told you about from that lovely detached stump work rose. The price of having all of these elements standing up off the fabric, having all that dimension, is wire on the back. It is bulk. It is a finishing problem. And when push came to shove, I mean, it seems so stupid to think that you could get this far in, that you could work all of those pieces, plunge all those wires, and then only realize late on the magnitude of the problem that you were facing. But that was where I found myself. I think I was carried along by excitement and hadn't given enough thought to some of the technical issues I would face. And some of that was an experience. I hadn't done something that was really heavy before. And some of that was just pure excitement carrying me along. I was so excited to do this rose, I didn't really stop to consider how would I be able to glue the rose down, and how could I get that into a finished object. So at this point, I could have put this piece away in a closet as a UFO to resolve later. And if I had done that, I think it would have been a serious blow to my confidence, because this was my first real attempt at casket stitching. And if it had failed for, you know, what was essentially a design flaw rather than technical failure in your stitching, it still would have been a critical blow to my confidence, because I think I have to explain here that a design flaw can be just as big a failure as a failure in your stitching. So if you're a cross stitcher and you're working a very large sampler with a continuous border, think a big one, and you go all the way around. You go all the way around and you go back to your starting point where your border is supposed to meet, and they don't. Much like Nicola described on her Flosstube this weekend. And you go back and you count and you try and find your mistake, and your counting seems to be okay, and you can't locate your mistake. And you've got to resolve this because your border doesn't meet, but you don't know where your flaw is or where you can fix it, where to take out your stitching. That was the same kind of feeling I was experiencing here. And then I had a problem. I knew what the problem was, and I didn't yet know how I was going to deal with it. I could identify the issue. I could not yet identify the solution. And the solution was to fundamentally rethink what this object was going to be. So for me, putting this piece away wasn't really an option, because I had done so much work. I had thought about this piece for so long. I was so in love with the historic object that inspired it, with that beautiful rose from the Met piece. I had to find a solution here. I could not put all of this work that I had done away as an unresolved, unfinished, maybe failure. I just couldn't do it, and I decided that I had to think of something. And thankfully, at that point, I remembered another object worked by another surface embroiderer. Her name is Rachel Kinnison. I will link to her posts about this object on her blog, both her finish and her rundown of the historic pieces that inspired it. She worked what she called a beaded padded mirror case, which is styled after, there are actually multiple historic examples that all take pretty much the same form. One of which is in this book. This is actually the same book I showed you in the last episode, the one that had that really awesome needle lace bird thimble holder. This is Embroidery, 1600 to 1700 at the Burrell collection. And this is a padded mirror case in the Burrell collection. So although it's really flattened out by the photograph, it takes the same essential shape as my object, which is a padded central panel with a flat surround, and then it's a case with an interior space in which your mother may or may not have hidden some things. So Rachel did a beaded object in this general form, and I remembered her finish, and I thought, you know, that might be the answer here, because it resolved all of my problems. With the panel lying flat, gravity is no longer the enemy. And the padding here, or at least the padding in the way that I worked it, is several layers of thick felt that I felted together to give it a nice solid firm ground, but it is springy enough that the wires, that the bulk on the back of this panel could sink in to the felt. They wouldn't stand off it and be bulk that was impeding your finish. The other awesome thing about this form is that there's no glue on the back of this panel, so I didn't have to face that issue at all. The way that this is finished is I took the center wood piece, I covered it in paper. Somebody asked me in a previous video, wood is corrosive to textiles. You always have to protect your work from the gases released by wood. It is not pH neutral and it can severely damage your textiles. So you always have to paper things first, and we will be covering that in my practical episode on boxes. So I papered the central wood piece that formed the lid. I attached the felted layers of wool felts to form the padding, and then I took my finished embroidery off the frame, I stretched it over the padding, and then I glued it down at the sides and in the bottom, which then I covered with velvet. And then I finished off the interior with a little padded pillow on which objects like a necklace in the way it was originally presented, or beaded leaves could eventually, beaded beaded flowers could rest. And then it also has a surround. And the surround, I think, is an example of sometimes how completely rethinking your design can lead to really great things, because as much as I love this central panel, it's really brought to a better design place by the addition of the darker green surround accented by the gold. It plays up the combination of green and gold, and the darker green of the surround really makes that center panel pop in a way that I don't think it would if it were a free floating panel inside the lid of a casket, for example. This is a shot silk. It's a very gray green. It shows differently in different lights, and although the fabric looks green in most lights, it's really, it pops against a true green like this. So the last problem I had to face in resolving this was that I didn't have a box of this type, and so I drafted up plans based on what would the size of the center padded piece need to be for my own stitched piece to fit over the padding, and then reverse engineered the size of the surround. really having a day here. Sorry guys from that. And a family friend who's a woodworker was able to make it for me in time for Christmas, because when I realized that this panel couldn't be what I had planned it to be, I decided to make it into a Christmas gift for my mother, and time was growing short, and that was really what determined the design of the surround, which is a very simple geometric design with couched gilt threads. It was styled after a lace pattern from the 17th century. I was looking for something simple that I could knock out in a short period of time, and also that would be flat on the back, because I was still really worried about finishing, and couching leads to a very flat back, something that's very easy to glue. So I pretty much copied this center band exactly, and then I smoothed these out into half circles, as you can see here. Funny story about this. So Christmas 2017, I had cooked this up with my dad, and we had hidden the box in the living room where we normally all gather as a family together for Christmas. And we proceeded with Christmas as we usually do, which in my family, we make a really big deal of Christmas, but it's not expensive or costly gifts. It's lots of handmade gifts. I make ornaments for my mom every year. I made her a wreath in 2017. Baked goods, I love to bake. Books, gag gifts, there's always a lot of laughter in our Christmas. We do very handmade Christmases. So, you know, we had our usual type of Christmas, and all the presents had ostensibly been unwrapped. And then we asked my mom to close her eyes. I retrieved the box from where I had hidden it. I set it in front of her, and then we told her to open her eyes. And she sat there just staring at it, stunned, speechless for what felt like forever. And then when she finally spoke, the first words out of her mouth were, "Katie, what did you do?" Not really what I was expecting, but it was a very positive reaction in the end, because she does love and cherish this piece, and it's found a really good home with her. So this is my padded jewelry box, and it's a success. It's a piece that, as I mentioned before, I'm really proud of. It's something that I love. It was also my first big object finish, which was huge for me. That was a big step. It really helped me build my confidence. And then in 2018, I went on to really make a serious start on my casket, and did succeed in eventually completing my casket, although that was a pretty long journey too. However, I don't want to leave you with the impression that my failures always end in success, that they always end in me magically rethinking what I was going to do and pulling success from the jaws of failure, and for this, you know, the problems I get myself into to resolve like this. This is probably more of an outlier than the usual story of how things go. And to that point, I have an example of a failure to show you today. This piece dates from 2016. It was originally a box, which I constructed myself. I'm not a woodworker, so I thought I could make a simple box out of mat board. And I could actually make a simple box out of mat board. It held together. But what I hadn't thought through was that my glue was water-based, and the water content of the glue caused the mat board to warp very, very badly when I did the finishing. So the finished object was a complete mess, and I ended up taking it apart. And these are the pieces that I salvaged from that finish. So lots of stump work bits. Those were the lid. It was kind of like a floral pattern stylized after. This was the inspiration piece. And I got some discards here too. They all just kind of ended up lumped together. And then this, which is piece I'm really sad about. I do really have to find something to do with this. If you've got an idea about how to rescue my sad abandoned bits, please leave it in the comments, because otherwise this might be sitting in my closet until doomsday. This is an embroidered Elizabethan heraldic garden inspired by a 17th century love gauntlet. And there were a lot of problems with this. The first was the finish. Silk satin's not very forgiving with glue. It is a closed weave as opposed to linen, which is an open weave. And open weave has space for air to escape. Silk satin does not. So if your gluing isn't perfect, air pockets form under your fabric, between your fabric and your backing paper. And because silk satin has such high shine, any little bubbles in the finishing are really obvious. And so in addition to the bubbles, which pissed me off so much that I ended up literally tearing the backing paper off the fabric here, I also didn't size this correctly for the box that I made. So when I went to put it in, I had to actually cut through my stitching, which was horrifying, and cut really close to the motifs, which is one of the issues in trying to rescue this and turn it into something else. I left myself no room to do something else with this. So this is one of my failures that I haven't yet rescued, and I may never rescue, in all honesty. It might sit there forever, or maybe it won't, but you know, I always have so many ideas. I always am moving on to new things, and so that means that I don't always go back and rescue the things that I'm not as in love with as I am with this. And so I'd like to finish here with some of the things I learned from this particular mistake. One of them was to know yourself as a stitcher, and my process is adaptive, essentially. So I have a design when I go in, but there's usually a great deal of change from concept to final execution. As you can see, I literally have some blank spaces here on my design that I filled in as I went. And micron pen is not mutable. You know, once your black line goes on the fabric, there is no unringing that bell. So now I never use micron pen on fabric. I always use ceramic pencil, which fades over time and means that you can adjust as you need, if you need to, as you stitch. And that proved to be a critical component of my process. Another thing I learned was that finishing was a skill that I really had to put work in on developing, because when the rubber hit the road here, I wasn't ready to put glue on the back of this piece, and I found that out the hard way. So after I did this, I put a lot of work into refining and developing my gluing process, which is something that I will be sharing with you so that you can learn and not have to go through this many failures, because that's a pretty painful process. So after I did this piece and realized that I had some serious work to do on my gluing, I developed the blue box, which I showed you in my first episode, as a finishing exercise, and I did that as an exercise in gluing embroidery to a box, and I did other projects to really refine my finishing techniques until I felt ready to do my next big finish. I didn't commit to finishing another large object until I felt like I was really ready. And the specific things I learned about gluing I will be sharing with you quite soon, because the things that are upcoming on Ornamentations, episode 5 is going to be about the interior of a box, the possibilities of the interior of a box, which can be very simple, or it can be more elaborate and complicated. It can be something that flows from the exterior, or it can be a surprise. You open the lid and you are faced with something completely unexpected and surprising, which I think is a really wonderful effect. That's actually what I ended up doing on my casket. And that's a fun little thing that we'll be getting to, not in this next episode. A casket will be an episode all of its own, but later on. So what you can do with interiors will be the substance of episode 5. We'll be looking at things ranging from a finished interior to works in process to things that are essentially just concepts with some pieces made for it, and a range of interiors from simple to three-dimensional and very complicated. So that's episode 5, and then looking forward to episode 6. Since I've been talking so much about boxes and finishing today, episode 6 will be my first practical in fitting embroidery to a wood box. So we will be talking general principles, all the steps that you take in adapting an embroidery to fit a box, in preparing your embroidery, gluing it to backing paper, and then gluing that to the prepared box, how you prepare the box, installing hardware, and of course all your cut edges have to be obscured by trim. So what to look for in trim, how to glue down trim. We'll be going through all the general principles in episode 6. I'll be giving you some examples of specific charts that I think you could adapt to a box without too much trouble. And then taking a look at my start, because I want to also do a full step-by-step tutorial for you to make this process very clear. Because there's a lot to learn, and I've done a lot in refining my skills. I've learned a lot, I've made a lot of mistakes, and that has led to a very defined process. And I want to share that with you so that you don't have to go through the same, doing a million things, encountering all these failures. Hopefully you can have a smoother and easier time, and if you want to, you can apply an embroidery to a box without falling flat on your face first. So step-by-step tutorial is coming, and to that end I have started Modern Folk Embroideries Forget-Me-Not, which I will be applying to a very simple wood box which I purchased from Amazon. I will be detailing the fabric, the thread that I used. I'll be sharing the exact box I bought, so you can follow along with me if you like, or you can just use it as a step-by-step example of how to do your own work and apply it to a box. So that's what's coming up. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed this jewelry box, because it really is one of my favorite pieces. It's something that I'm really proud of and that I really love and am proud to have finished. So please comment, and on that note, if I did not respond to you and you commented, I'm really sorry. I was not getting notifications on everything, and I tried to go through and respond to everybody, but I may have missed somebody. I do love reading your comments. I love hearing your feedback. I love hearing about what you liked, and it's so helpful for me because I am still new at this, and it's just enjoyable and rewarding to hear what you think and what you liked. So please comment. Subscribe if you liked this video and you want to see more, and I will be back with you in 2 weeks to talk about the potential of the interior of a box. And until then, happy stitching.